We do have the heater going, so it's a little loud, but we have the 67 Chevy truck C10 up on the lift. Center caps are off, lug nuts are off. We're getting ready to pull all these wheels and tires off and get to work on this thing. These are some meats, so it's huge. First thing first is we're actually going to go ahead and we took the bolts off the bottom of the shock, 2 per side. Bottom of the shock's loose. We'll go ahead and take the upper mount out, get that shock totally out of there. We did go ahead and undo the end links and the frame mounts of the sway bar. So the sway bar is ready to come out. And we're just going to keep going and rip this front suspension down and get ready for our new parts. We do have SpeedTech uppers, SpeedTech lowers. Alright, so we got everything loosened up. We're working on the top shock bolt. It's a stud sticking up with a nut on it. They can be a pain. The piston of the shock likes to spin. So we have our, from the up top here, we have our impact on here, and a lot of times it makes quick work of that. I did try to put vice grips on the top of the shock, and it just kept spinning. But I already got the other side off. With those shocks off, it's time to get everything kind of laid out. We still have to take the upper and lower control arms off, of course, and the spring. We'll get that in a second, but I'm just laying everything out here, making sure we have everything that we need. Sorry about the heater, it's a little loud. So the SpeedTech upper and lowers, we have the Viking coilovers with the bigger springs that you would normally see because it is a pickup truck. So we have to assemble this stuff. This spring actually goes up in the pocket, and then the coilover goes through, and the bottom cup. We'll get to all that. I'll show you how all that assembles, but very nice setup here. I was playing around with the knobs on here. They're all the way down, so all the way down you can obviously push down and pull up pretty easy. If you take and really crank these things up, you drastically change the compression and rebound of that shock. So we should be able to dial the ride in pretty nice in this truck. Nice pieces here. All right, we have of course those shocks out now, so we went ahead and we have our pole jack under here. Before we take any of this apart, there's a lot of pressure on that spring. I know a lot of you get very skittish when it comes to spring pressure, but there's an easy way to do this. The first thing you want to do, obviously we have it on the lift, we have our pole jack under it. Go ahead and jack this and make sure you can take the pressure off the suspension without making the truck teeter. And I already checked that we can compress this spring with this pole jack out here. So that's not an issue. So we have a little bit of pressure on it right now. We pulled the pins out of the ball joints, the cotter pins. We're going to go ahead and loosen a little bit the top nut and the bottom nut on the ball joint. Once we have them loose, we'll back them. Actually, we have them loose right now. So I'll just spin this out a little bit, just about there. The top one's the same. We'll spin that out. And then I'm gonna actually take, with some pressure on here so it doesn't move anywhere. And we know that once this upper A-arm has a bump stop on there, it keeps that from coming down. So it's not the whole pressure of the spring until we pop these ball joints loose. Once we pop them, obviously that top A-arm is not going to be holding it anymore. All the weight of that spring will be on the pole jack. So we do have some tension there. We'll take a hammer and hit here, pop the ball joints loose. And once we have those loose, we can let this down and safely take that spring out. Sounds like a lot, and if you've never did it before, it may be a little intimidating, but it is pretty safe this way. If you really wanted to do something as far as safety, you could take and run a strap down through that spring, through here, down through the A-arm here, and strap that in, but we're not worried about it. I did this a lot a bunch of times before and it always works fine. So let's go ahead and get these ball joints popped loose, and then we can let that spring pressure off with this pole jack. With those popped loose, we jack the pole jack up a little bit, and as you can see here, we have some pressure there or off there. So we can just take and remove the nut here from the upper tie rod, the ball joint rather. So now we have very little to no pressure on there. With that removed, now we can just crank this pole jack down. As you can see, our suspension is now coming down. Once we hit a certain point, this will flop down, just about like that. And again, we don't have any tension on that ball joint either. It's popped loose, but we still have the nut on there. We'll just keep letting this down. And that's relieving the pressure, the tension on that spring. And with that further apart, obviously, we have a lot of distance here. We got that pretty far down. Pulled the spindle off the bottom ball joint also. We just set that aside. We don't need to unhook that at all. We're not replacing that stuff. We do need to disassemble the spindle there, but we'll wait and get our spring out, get our upper A-arm off, our lower A-arm, and get our new stuff put back on there before we worry about that. We did take the caliper off. I should have did that first. It gives you more room to pivot this stuff without the hose being bound up. So let's keep going. We'll get that spring out. Once we have that all the way down, the spring can pull out. So we have the spring out. Now we'll go ahead and loosen the bolts up, remove that lower A-arm, control arm, whatever you want to call it, out of the vehicle, and then we can lower it down and remove the top one also. With the new A-arm in place, they are labeled. This one's passenger side. Of course, that's the side we're working on. We have these holes lined up. You might have to take a small, soft-based mallet, so you don't want to hit something steel on there, mess up the powder coat. Get these lined up. You may have to tweak these ears on the frame ever so slightly if they were crimped down from being over torqued before. But we have our bolts back in, and we'll go ahead and put the nuts on there. Leave it all loose for now, so this all pivots nice and free. So looks like I got a little ahead of myself. It's not a bad idea to run your old bolts through just to line everything up in case you have to tap the bolt through, but they do give you new hardware, new bolts and nylock, or not nylock, like a stove locker nut on there. So we have a complete hardware kit here. Here's the 2 bolts for the other side and the nuts. They do give you tie rod sleeves. These are nice billet pieces with the lock nut too. We'll get to them after we get the rest of the assembly installed. And here are the end links with rod ends, knocking everything down here. But again, very, very nice. It's nice they give you all the new hardware also. With this back down, we'll show you on this side because it's a little easier to see. Of course, this upper A-arm is held in by 2 studs and nuts on this crossbar. One here, same as on the other side. So when you take these off, all you have to do is remove that nut, and try and keep your shims separated. We'll put those shims back to get a rough alignment. It will need a front end alignment, of course, when we're done, but that will give us a rough alignment to go off of. Sometimes you do have to pull these studs out and lift up that A-arm to gain clearance. Like for instance, this one, steering shaft's right in the way, so we could not slip off. So we'll have to pull these studs out, but no big deal. The new arms do come assembled, ready to install. We have the bump stop on there, new ball joints with grease fitting. The crossbars, a nice piece of machined metal, grease fittings, and the nuts on the end do have cotter pins in to keep everything together. So that, because it's tubular, installs a lot easier. It moves a whole lot easier. We may have to trim some on that inner fender. They are shaped a little bit different depending on how much travel we end up with. That's a lot of travel, so I don't know if we'll be going that far or not, but we'll keep an eye on that and trim if necessary. Again, the 2 bolts, they just slip on these studs. Put the nut on the back side and reinstall the shims that were in there before, just to give us a rough idea of alignment. With all that back attached, the upper A-arms, they're actually it's got a bearing here with a grease fitting, and they move super easy. It does have the bump stop there, just like factory. Absolutely no play front to back, and they move and glide super easy on there. You can see how much better that's going to be than the stock bushing type. So the next step is going to be, we're going to test fit these Viking shocks. The adjustments go out towards the outside spindle of the car. We have our washer and rubber grommet on there, so we're going to put that up through here and come out the hole where, there we go, out of the hole where the factory shock was. With that slid on, we're going to install our second rubber piece, our upper bushing, or yeah, that's our bushing, that's our washer. We have that installed. We have the nut just finger tight that's holding that whole shock in place. We don't have our spring or adjusting nuts on there yet. Shock is fully extended down. We're going to move this up, put the bolts through these holes here, and then just move that suspension up and down, making sure we clear everywhere through here. No binding, everything looks the way it should. With that installed, you can see our hardware down through there. We have plenty of clearance around here. Again, we'll have to check, make sure our shock our shock's good. We'll make sure our spring right there clears once we install that on this opening here. But now we can actually take and move this through its range and make sure all that's clear. Actually looks good. So we'll pop this back apart. We do have to assemble our shocks here. They do want a anti-seize of some sort on the threads on the shock, the aluminum shock body. You don't want the threads to go. So the first nut here, adjusting nut, we put with that shoulder facing up. This next one will go with the big shoulder facing up, so it'll go on that way. And then the Torrington bearing and the 2 washers, once we lube them, will go over top of this. And then our spring will actually sit on top of all of that. Once we have all that lubed up and installed, we did adjust it all the way down. That'll give us more room and less tension to get that spring in there. So the next step will actually be putting our spring on, and that will go on, obviously small end. We'll set it down like that. The shock will go right through the center of the spring, and then that small end will seat right down here. We'll take this whole assembly and slide it up through the factory frame there. And with that installed in there, again, our bushing, our washer, and our nut, finger tight. We have plenty of movement here, so we'll take our lower A-arm back up, put our bolts through, attach the nuts. This cross T-bar does sit on top of that plate there. It does help as you're assembling this stuff if you rotate the spring. Of course, we have a lot of play here in this whole assembly. So if we rotate the spring so it goes, the coils go in between the frame there, if you can see that, that will help us go back further. Right about there, that'll help us go back further so we can get this connected. Once this goes up, that whole assembly kind of moves back this way or out this way and centers up in this hole in the frame. So with all that reinstalled, that's the way it should look. The bolts, the nylock nuts there, you could really do them either way. It was easier, just drop the bolt in. Spring has some clearance here. So we'll go ahead and actually take this upper A-arm, reinstall it in the spindle here, put the nut on, and we'll start snugging all this up. And with this side put together also, we're going to tackle the sway bar end links. This bump stop here can be swiveled so you can get that bolt to go through. Slip this Heim joint in there and go ahead and put that bolt through. Put the nylock nut and washer on the other side. And now we'll prep the sway bar for installation. All right, we have our sway bar laid out here. We have our frame bushings. I have a split them so you can pop them over the bar. Here's the frame bracket. It looks like we have to, they do give you a whole kit here, but it looks like we're gonna reuse our factory frame bolts, which is fine. And here is the other ends of the end link, but we'll get to that in a second. They do give you some lube for the bushing. So we'll go ahead and put some lube on the inside of that bushing, snap that over on the bar. You don't want that squeaking as you're moving around. We'll get those installed and get this thing installed up on the frame. And with that up there, we'll go ahead and snug up these frame mounts. Get all this pulled into place here. We'll leave it loose, but we're gonna go ahead and snug everything just so it's where it needs to be. For the bolt, there's a bushing and a washer up top, a bushing and a washer at the bottom. The spacer goes on, the bolt slides through. That jam nut right there goes at the bottom, and then you have to thread the rod end on to the bolt after that. With all that together on this side too, our jam nut is still loose. We can take a socket or a wrench, whatever, on top here, and we can turn this and tighten this up. And we'll tighten this up until these two bushings here squeeze out and are about the same diameter as the washer. As you can see right now, they're a little smaller. Once you get that snugged up, it will squeeze these out. Once they're about the same diameter, then you can tighten that jam nut down against the bottom eyelet here, your rod end, and then we can go ahead and tighten this bottom bolt up too. Front suspension pretty much done. We still have to do the Wilwood disc brakes. Here's a sneak peek at what's going on. Wilwood six piston calipers in the front, 4 piston in the back, and the rotors are absolutely giant. So that's that. Before we go too much further, I'll probably stop the video here and continue with the brake install later, because that's kind of a separate deal. But the suspension package, other than torquing stuff down, we'll have to do that as we do the brakes anyway. So there'll be some no sense doing that right now with having to do the brakes and adjusting ride height, but we can't do all that until we get the full weight of the truck. But as a sneak peek, I don't have the back wheels on it at all right now, so she's sitting a lot lower than it used to. So obviously those wheels will not be on it once those brakes go on, because the rotor doesn't even fit inside that rim. So stay tuned. We're getting ready to tackle the brakes in the front. We'll tackle the brakes in the back. We're doing a disc brake, Wilwood disc brake conversion on that, and that's going to be a little interesting. We'll get to that later. And then we're going to tackle the performance. So it's getting a bunch of engine work too. It's going to get a Texas speed cam, an intake, a stall converter, and some other dress up stuff. So thanks for stopping by. Have a good day.